Parents, this is part 2 of an introduction to classical education by Christopher Perrin. I'm going to be starting on page 19, classical education again. Rather than merely citing the illustrious record of classical education, I wish to cite more modern evidence. I wish to cite the students in classical schools and homeschools. Their delight and joy in their learning are usually the first things prospective parents note. The grammar school students sing and clap out history timelines, science facts, Latin vocabulary, Bible verses, and rules of grammar. They do this throughout the day, usually with great verve and delight. They remember this knowledge set to music with alarming accuracy and permanence. Dialectic, or logic students, you will witness, spend much of their day arguing with their teachers and peers. Perhaps, to the surprise of some, they are encouraged to do this by their teachers, who are charged with the formidable task of teaching them not to just argue, but to argue well. Most will observe that these adolescents seem to enjoy the process. Parents often discover, with some frustration, that such students grow increasingly better at pointing out the fallacies committed in dinnertime conversation by everyone present, including Grandpa. Rhetoric, high school students, have already studied a good bit of grammar and logic. What they wish to do is weave these disciplines into attractive speech and writing. Having learned how to win arguments, they now learn how to win people. For rhetoric is the art of persuasive speech and writing. You will find these older students writing a good bit in many genres. You will also find them speaking before their peers as a regular course, whether making a political or forensic speech or presenting a lab report. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric are all central disciplines in classical schools. You might have noticed that these disciplines also receive emphasis at various stages or periods in the school. Grammar is emphasized during the elementary years, logic during the junior high years, and rhetoric during the high school years. Therefore, grammar will be taught in some form in all grades, K through 12, but receives special emphasis and attention in grades K through 6. The same is true of logic and rhetoric. The assumption here is that these subjects are always operating in some form, but that they are suited to be explicitly taught at certain stages in a child's development. As such, each trivium subject is seen as a paradigm or master subject that colors and guides the way the other subjects in the curriculum are taught. For example, virtually every subject in the dialectic school will be taught dialectically. Students will be arguing, debating, and discussing in math, science, history, and theology classes. In the rhetoric school, high school, students will be writing persuasive essays and giving speeches in several classes outside of the rhetoric class. Dorothy Sayers argued that the trivium subjects are not really subjects at all, but a means of method for handling and learning subjects. A kind of master of art, a tool that enables one to study any subject. She compared each trivium art to a tool, like a chisel or a plane that once mastered can be applied to fashion all varieties of wood subjects. While we are used to thinking of grammar as a subject, and it has been reduced to a mere self-contained subject in modern schools, it has traditionally been viewed as an all-encompassing discipline or art. The same is true of logic and rhetoric. This point cannot be emphasized enough. Our teachers of the last generation have divided knowledge into relatively isolated subjects without emphasizing the interconnection of all knowledge. We have learned subjects without actually learning how to tackle these subjects. We have not learned how to learn. We might say that we have been set to work hammering, chiseling, planing, and carving without ever being taught how to use the tools. We have picked up what we could as we went along, incidentally. The classical educators start from the other end and emphasize the importance and use of those master tools that could be widely applied. Of course, in order to learn the use of these master tools, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, it is necessary to apply them to some piece of wood, to some subject. And so actually, subjects must be studied, English, Latin, history, etc. But note that the chief goal was to master the tools, for in mastering the tools, the subject, any subject, would soon be mastered as well. We encounter a paradox. Classical educators favor tool over content, and therefore help students to master more content than ever. They have taught their students how to learn. Sayers also recognized that classical educators tended to teach students these tools at certain developmental stages. As the students age and mature, teachers adjust the manner and means by which they teach. Factual information, grammar, vocabulary, and syntax are emphasized in the grammar school years, K through 6, frequently by means of singing and chanting, as well as by direct instruction, reading, and discussion. Principles and relations are emphasized in all subjects during the middle school years by means of reasoning, debate, and discussion, fueled by the dedicated study of logic. Effective and persuasive speaking and writing are emphasized during the high school years by means of training in theory, imitation of great writing and speech, and frequent practice. Sayers characterized the grammar stage as the poll parrot stage, when students love to memorize, sing, and repeat whatever they encounter. She characterized the dialectic stage as the pert stage, when students challenge authorities, ask how and why, and enjoy arguing and debating. She characterized the rhetoric stage as the poetic stage, when students are more interested in creative thinking and expression. To be clear then, the word grammar, logic, and rhetoric have a range of meaning. These words can refer to self-contained subjects, or they can refer to a method or art of learning all subjects. Finally, they can be used to describe 3 developmental stages through which children progress: Latin and Greek. Classical schools are also known for teaching classical languages, usually Latin, but sometimes both Latin and Greek. Latin has been taught in classical schools for centuries, even after it ceased to be a popular spoken language. There is a good reason for this, for the study of Latin rewards us richly in several ways. Latin is a fundamental subject in classical schools and homeschools. It is one of the paradigm disciplines of the grammar school through which students learn the rudiments and structure of language, the Latin language, the English language, and through them, the structure of all language. Latin is the mother tongue for over 50% of all English words. So the study of Latin greatly enhances one's English vocabulary. Often, just one Latin word is responsible for several English words. Take, for example, the Latin word porto, I carry. From this word are derived port, portal, porter, porch, airport, import, important, transport, export, report, and portable. In this case, one Latin word helps yield 11 English words. A pretty good investment. Latin also helps students understand grammar. As they learn Latin grammar, they are learning or reinforcing their knowledge of English grammar. Our own way of labeling and analyzing English grammar evolved from the study of Latin grammar. All those grammatical terms such as a verb, noun, adjective, and adverb are all Latin words developed to understand Latin grammar. The grammar of Latin language is logical, straightforward, and highly regular, making it an ideal language to learn grammar that can be applied to many other languages, including, of course, English. It has been shown repeatedly that the study of Latin quickens and enables one's mastery of English. SAT and GRE scores rise. In fact, the students scoring the highest on the verbal section of the GRE are not English students, but classics majors. Anyone who wants to see the hard statistical facts demonstrating the value of Latin today is encouraged to visit the website, the National Committee for the Study of Latin and Greek, or www.promotelatin.org. Studying a foreign language early, many classical schools start in 3rd grade with a formal course, has always been the classical way, and is proven wise by experience, for students acquire language fast when young. Students typically learn 10 new Latin words a week with far greater ease than their parents. Students at this age are eager to learn language, and many of them profess Latin as a favorite subject. Finally, we should mention that Latin is also the mother tongue of the so-called Romance languages: Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. They are called the Romance languages because they directly descend from the language of the Romans, which was Latin. If 50% of our words in English come from Latin, up to 90% of the words in these languages come from Latin. For example, puerta in Latin means door. Puerta in Spanish means door. Amicus in Latin means friend. In Spanish and Portuguese, it's amigo, and in Italian, amico, and in French, ami, and in Romanian, amic. When a student learns Latin, he is also doing advanced work in these languages given birth by Latin. If Latin is responsible for 50% of our English vocabulary, Greek is responsible for an additional 30%. Greek is also the basis for much medical and scientific vocabulary and has the advantage of being the language of the New Testament, making it very valuable for study in Christian schools. Those who study Latin and Greek will achieve the utmost understanding of English vocabulary and grammar, and will also find that Latin and Greek reinforce one another since they are both inflected languages. Nouns and verbs have variable endings with a very similar structure. Those who have studied multiple languages know that after one language has been learned, the second and third come much faster and easier. After learning how to fly one kind of plane, pilots are quickly on their way to flying another. Musicians who have learned one instrument can learn a second or third with much greater faculty than those who are just starting their first. Students, therefore, who study Latin and or Greek will find that they are on their way to learning additional languages, especially Romance languages, with much less effort. Integration of learning. I have mentioned that classical educators do not see subjects as self-contained and isolated. Knowledge is more like a web than a chest of drawers. There are no subjects that are unrelated to others. Literature, history, and theology, for example, are quite intertwined. Anything from the past in any subject can be history. Anything committed to creative or excellent writing can be literature, and any subject considered in relation to God and biblical teaching can be theology. Until the 19th century, educators understood and taught knowledge as a web rather than as separate departments. Classical educators, therefore, while teaching classes in history or literature, keep the boundaries light and fluid and emphasize the interrelationship of all knowledge. The teaching of Latin is an apt example of how classical educators integrate knowledge. Latin really is not a simple self-contained subject. Latin is found virtually everywhere. It is found in all English writing, since 50% of English words come from Latin. So many classical teachers are constantly showing students those Latin root words, thus expanding their understanding and vocabulary of English. Latin is found in science. I recall the day my daughter came home with a science worksheet describing carnivorous, herbivorous, and omnivorous animals, and delightfully showed me that one word was from caro, carnis, flesh meat, one from herba, herbae, grass plant, and the last from omnis, omni, all. Before her teacher told her, she knew what kind of animals were territorial, arboreal, and aquatic, of the land, the tree, and the water. Latin is found in literature. Much of the best literature up to about 1950, and some afterwards, frequently contains Latin allusions or quotations. It is certainly in history, since the Roman Empire dominated Europe for at least 1,000 years. Latin inscriptions abound not only in Rome, but also in Washington, D.C., and in American historical documents. Latin is logic. All the fallacies of informal logic have Latin names, like argumentum ad hominem, argument to the man, abusing the person rather than addressing his argument, and argumentum ad baculum, argument to the stick, appealing to force, to persuade someone to adopt your argument. As in logic, Latin is also in rhetoric. All of the figures of speech have Latin or Greek names, such as alliteration and assonance. The 5 basic rules, canons of rhetoric, all have Latin names, as well as their subcategories. Perhaps you can imagine the integration opportunities for other subjects, like history, Bible, theology, literature, and science. There are a legion. Joining the great conversation via the great books. Classical educators have always emphasized the importance of mastering the masters. Believing that there are real standards of beauty, goodness, and truth, they dare to pronounce some books good and some poor. They even went so far, over time, as to conclude some books the very best. In the old sense of the word, they were discriminating. Books that have been declared as great books by a consensus of informed critics have long periods of time we dare to call classics. These books can also be judged by their influence. They are great books because they contain great ideas that have given birth to a great and ongoing conversation about what is beautiful, good, and true, and 99 other great ideas if we take Mortimer Adler at his word. In classical schools, We seek to read the great books, the classics. We know that there's some great contemporary literature being published, and we do read a sampling of the best we can find and judge in our own culture. We lean heavily, however, to those books which have proven themselves by their beauty, profundity, and shaping influence. Reading the classics also has the advantage of challenging our modern perspective. As C.S. Lewis aptly points out, quote, "It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself a new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones. Every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our period, and that means old books." End quote. Starting in the grammar school grades, we choose children's literary classics from various times and genres. Examples include Aesop's fables, fairy tales, and titles such as The Courage of Sarah Noble, Peter Rabbit, The Boxcar Children, Little Women, The Door in the Wall, The Wind in the Willows, Johnny Tremaine, King Arthur, Robin Hood, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Hobbit, Where the Red Fern Grows, Treasure Island, The Adventure of Tom Sawyer, and The Bronze Bow, to name just a few. As students rise into the dialectic school, they begin to read books suitable to their development and reasoning ability. The tools for a life of learning. We have all heard the proverb, "Give a man a fish and he eats a meal. Teach him how to fish and he eats for a lifetime." By now, I trust the reader can guess the application to classical education. We teach students how to fish, only they are fishing for knowledge and feeding their minds. The pole, the line, and the hook are grammar, logic, and rhetoric, always with them in their tackle box as they seek out wisdom and eventually teach others. Put another way, classical educators seek to teach students how to learn for themselves. If, for example, we compare logic to a sharp knife, we seek to impart to our students a very sharp knife indeed. There will always be wood enough to carve, other subjects and fields of knowledge. If we can give students a sharp blade, they can carve whatever new wood they find. This insight inspired Dorothy Sayers to refer to the trivium subjects as tools of learning, a metaphor that has become prevalent among classical educators. Students who have mastered language, that is, who have mastered grammar and vocabulary, logic, reasoning, and persuasive, eloquent speaking and writing, have the requisite tools necessary to study and master any subject they choose. We might hope that they will be ready for college and the rest of their life. We can imagine such a student in college tackling a new subject. He has learned in the early grammar years to approach a subject by breaking it down to its fundamental parts and mastering them by memorizing them, using chants, songs, and other mnemonic devices. He has learned during the logic years to study the ordered relationship among these parts and to derive the principles that govern them. Finally, he has learned during his rhetoric years to discover how to take his acquired knowledge and communicate it effectively and creatively, applying it to new and varied situations and needs. Now he faces, say, anatomy for the first time. He would know how to start by 1, breaking it down to the fundamentals, the various parts of the human anatomy, and master these using songs, chants, and such. By 2, studying the relationships of these fundamental, the relationships between the skeletal and muscular systems. And 3, write and speak clearly on what has been learned, applying and integrating this knowledge in new settings. Anatomical vocabulary, strange to his peers, would be friendly to him, all based in Latin and Greek, which he has studied. I have used anatomy as an example of how a classical education should prepare students for lifelong study. Some think that a classical education may prepare students for further studies in English, language, or history, but not scientific subjects. Historically, this is not the case. The trivium arts lead to the quadrivium arts. The mastery of language leads to the mastery of science. The great scientists of the past were virtually all educated classically. Mortimer Adler cites the education of the great German scientists of the last century. Quote, "The connection of liberal education with scientific creativity is not mere speculation. It is a matter of historical fact that the great German scientists of the 19th century had a solid background in the liberal arts. They all went through a liberal education which embraced Greek, Latin, logic, philosophy, and history, in addition to mathematics, physics, and other sciences. Actually, this has been the educational preparation of European scientists down to the present time. Einstein, Bohr, Fermi, and other great modern scientists were developed not by technical schools, but by liberal education. Douglas Wilson cites another famous German scientist and chemistry professor, Baer, who, when asked if he preferred new college students who had been scientifically or classically educated, answered that he preferred the latter. Baer said that after 3 months in college, the classically educated students surpassed others who had taken more science courses. He believed that classical students had the best trained minds, which uniquely prepared them for science study. Quote, "Give me a student who has been taught his Latin grammar," he said, "and I will answer for his chemistry." Whether science or literature, history or philosophy, law or medicine, whether business or art, politics or ministry, the classically educated student will be prepared for study, mastery, and achievement. He should fish well. Classical education, then, is a lifelong process of applying the tools of learning, tools that are the skills entailed in grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and that travel with the student through his various stages of learning. The tools are sometimes called grammar, logic, or rhetoric, as are the stages. The following diagram portrays a wheel of education that integrates both the tools and stages of classical education. Peace, rigor, and delight. G.K. Chesterton pointed out that teaching a child involves disruption and a kind of educational violence. Students are compelled to lay aside their notions of free play and come to a building where a score of adults insists that they work hard at subjects we thrust upon them. Chesterton writes, "Education is violent because it is creative. It is creative because it is human. It is as reckless as play in the field. It is as reckless as playing on the fiddle, as dogmatic as drawing a picture, as brutal as building a house. In short, it is what all human action is. It is an interference with life and growth." This is to say, classical educators acknowledge that education is hard work for teacher and pupil. I say this after declaring earlier that students generally delight in classical education, that we teach them the way they want to be taught. I still hold this as true, but I also believe that hard work and academic rigor do not exclude delight. Classical educators hold to the paradox that joy and labor can live together. Yes, something is being given up, play, TV, video games, etc. But something wonderful is being gained, another language, new and thrilling books, and the marvels of history, science, and math. Neil Postman has helped us to see how TV has left us with the notion that all education must be entertaining or amusing. This way of thinking is persuasive, but erroneous. Children can find even deeper pleasure than the TV and find them through rigorous work towards high prizes. Surely you remember working hard for something you prized, perhaps even your beloved. The words student and diligence retain this same ethos. Studere means to be eager for or zealous. Diligere means to love or to delight in. One can quickly see the connection. We are diligent about those things we love, whether people, knowledge, or skill. The diligent athlete loves to perform well, to win. The diligent lover stops at nothing to win his lady. The diligent musician practices for hours out of a love for music and thirst for virtuosity. And the diligent student who is captured by and zealous for knowledge, skill, and wisdom. So classical educators encourage students to live up to their name. We try to foster zeal, eagerness, and diligence. We try to hold before them the beauty and allure of language, history, and math. We make an appeal to their hearts as well as their minds and model for them a passion for learning and study. We can do this best in a peaceful environment with clear rules of student behavior. It may seem odd, but our children are generally happy and enthused, and they run and yell on the playground, but are peaceful and secure. Enthusiasm and peace can also coexist.